Imagine waking up one morning in Kaliningrad, flicking the switch, and nothing happens. The hum of transformers is gone, the lights stay dark, and the only electricity left is what your own plants can muster. This isn't a blackout by accident, this is a disconnection by design, and it began with Lithuania tearing down its power lines to Kaliningrad in mid-September 2025, marking a dramatic moment in the Baltics' long journey to energy independence from Russia. On September 19, 2025, Lithuania's electricity operator, Litgrid, announced it had fully dismantled all of the high-voltage power lines that once connected its grid with Russia's Kaliningrad exclave. These included three 330 kilovolts and three 110 kilovolts overhead lines. According to Litgrid, some segments had already been removed in the weeks following the Baltic states' grid separation earlier in the year, and by mid-September no physical cable or tower remained along the border. The move, it argues, marks a symbolic and practical closure of Lithuania's last electrical tie to Russia. But this was not a sudden decision. It was the culmination of years, even decades, of strategy, investment, and geopolitical tension. On February 8, 2025, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia officially disconnected their grids from Russia's IPS-UPS, also known as the Brel Ring, and began operating independently before synchronizing with the European Continental Electricity Network, NTSO-E or CSA, the next day. The accession of the Baltic states to the continental European grid was validated by the European Commission on that date. The changeover was hailed as a turning point in European energy sovereignty and integration. Cross-border wires to Belarus and Russia were physically dismantled after the disconnect. Lithuania asserted that it had finished a symbolic but important process of eliminating all border lines to Kaliningrad by September. By the middle of 2027, all 12 remaining connections with Belarus and Kaliningrad, 5 at 330 kilovolts and 7 at 110 kilovolts, are to be cut off. Understanding the Baltics' energy dependency and the geopolitical vulnerability it creates with Russia is essential to appreciating the significance of this change. For decades, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were part of a shared Soviet-era grid known as BRELL, an acronym reflecting Belarus, Russia, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. That grid was centrally synchronized from Russia, maintaining the standard 50 Hz frequency. While the Baltics technically could import or export power, Moscow had de facto control over frequency stability and flow, a mechanism that could be leveraged as a form of energy coercion. Indeed, Russia has a history of using energy supply as a tool of pressure. In past disputes, Gazprom halted or throttled gas supplies to Ukraine, Bulgaria, and other neighbors during times of political friction. For the Baltics, such risks were never theoretical. They faced possible blackouts in frigid winters and disruptions to heating, hospital infrastructure, water pumping, and general public safety. To break this dependence, the Baltic states embarked on an ambitious infrastructure overhaul. Over the years, they built and strengthened interconnectors: Litpol Link to Poland, the Nordbalt cable to Sweden, and Estlink to Finland. The Harmony Link project, initially envisioned as an undersea link between Lithuania and Poland, has been factored into broader synchronization planning. The EU co-financed much of this effort. Baltic synchronization reportedly drew over €1.2 billion in EU funding as part of its Connecting Europe facility. By some counts, the total Baltic upgrade, including network improvements, frequency stabilization components, and new interconnects, reached about €1.6 billion. When the disconnection occurred in February, it was not a blind leap. The three Baltic grids were run in island mode, self-sufficiently, for 24 hours, checking frequency, voltage balance, and system resilience. Only after successful tests did they synchronize with the European grid at 1200 GMT, which would be early afternoon local time. In a symbolic act to break the previous connections, Latvian technicians are shown physically cutting wires at Vilaka, close to the Russian border, in transition photos. The advantages, such as improved energy security and reduced reliance on Russian influence, were celebrated right away. With increased resilience built in, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania could now freely import and export electricity within the larger European grid. This has been dubbed the second independence of the Baltics by analysts. However, Kaliningrad has turned into an energy island disconnected from Russia's internal grid, whereas the Baltic nations have now completely merged with Europe. A large portion of Kaliningrad's electricity has historically been imported from nearby Baltic systems and Russian power plants via the BRELL ring. It must now operate independently using its own generating capacity because it is not connected to the grid. The region also depends on natural gas transit via a pipeline through Lithuania, under a contract that expires in late 2025. Any disruption to that gas transit could strain its generation ability. In June 2025, a substation in Kaliningrad was reportedly sabotaged and temporarily cut power to some military facilities, an event that underscored just how vulnerable a now isolated grid can be to attack. On the diplomatic front, Russia has loudly protested Lithuania's dismantling of cross-border lines. Moscow has framed it as an act of economic aggression, a provocation designed to isolate Kaliningrad from the mainland. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov reportedly compared the move to NATO aggression. Meanwhile, the Kremlin has fortified its military posture around Kaliningrad, deploying additional Iskander missile systems near Kaliningrad's borders with Lithuania and Poland. Analysts view this as a show of force and a signal that Moscow views Kaliningrad as a forward bastion in Europe, power cuts or not. Beyond the powerhouse symbolism, the blackout carries tangible consequences for residents. Kaliningrad's electricity prices have reportedly risen, and access to repair parts and capital investment is strained by sanctions. Supply chains are more fragile too. Spare equipment for power plants often must cross through Lithuania or Poland under strict scrutiny. Some locals have turned to firewood or alternative heating sources. At the strategic level, the Baltics' move to cast off Moscow's grid control underscores a broader shift in European energy geopolitics. Once trivial engineering, transformers, lines, switches, is now frontline infrastructure. Northern European nations like Finland have already aligned more closely with the European network. Ukraine is importing gigawatts from the EU and aims to fully integrate. And Belarus, long Russia's energy partner, has hinted at wanting alternatives by 2027. For NATO, securing energy lines, protecting undersea cables, defending transformer stations, and guarding against cyber or kinetic attacks on grid infrastructure have become central to deterrence. In the end, it's a stark lesson. When electricity flows, so does power, political, strategic, and symbolic. Lithuania's act wasn't just about wires and towers. It was a sovereign statement that Europe rewires its own fate, and that in the modern contest for influence, control of the grid is as consequential as the control of borders. That brings us up to now. Lithuania has physically dismantled the lines to Kaliningrad, and Kaliningrad is now electrically marooned. The Baltics celebrate energy emancipation. Russia watches its exclave teeter. In our next segment, we'll dig deeper. What happens if the gas transit path is disrupted? Could hybrid warfare escalate? And might we see energy blackouts become just another front in the new logic of confrontation? Stay tuned for part 2.